Hello everyone, my name is Katherine Drotos. Thank you for coming to my talk. And I'm going to talk to you today about some work I've been doing for my PhD, which is a case study in scientific telephone, where a scientific estimate became enshrined as a fact. So we all have truisms in our work, things that may appear in an introduction to a lot of papers that you see over and over again. So for example, things like climate change is the most important challenge of our time. The Earth will warm by X degrees by X date. Maybe you can think of a specific definition that is often used in your field. So these truisms appear over and over again. They may or may not be referenced, and they're sort of taken for granted after a while as being something that is true. So before we move on, I want to ask, how confident are you in every piece of information you've included in a manuscript? Might seem like a simple question, but something to consider as we move through the talk. So I study lichens. Lichens are a symbiosis between fungi, algae, and bacteria. They're found in every terrestrial environment on the globe, in many different growth forms, as you can see here on the left. They're usually very pretty, they're very charismatic, they fulfill a number of ecosystem roles, and they're just, in general, a really interesting group to study. So I have often come across this statistic. 8% of terrestrial environments are dominated by lichens. It often comes up in the introduction of lichen biology papers as sort of the foundational knowledge to then narrow into whatever the paper is talking about. And I thought maybe I would include this in one of my own papers because I thought, this sort of seems like a really sort of foundational piece of knowledge about lichen biology. But what was interesting was I couldn't find the paper. I found the citation, which said that it was from Larson, 1987. It had the journal, it had the issue, but I couldn't find it on any databases. I couldn't find it on Web of Science, I couldn't find it in our library, and I ended up having to go through a Lichenology listserv in order to find it. And this is what I found. It was actually a paper by Doug Larson, who actually is a former Guelph professor. He published this in a conference proceedings in 1987, and the actual quote from the paper says, "When one considers the roughly 8% of the Earth's terrestrial surface that is lichen-dominated, one is impressed with how well this particular alga-fungus mutualism has extended the range of its previously free-living, drought-sensitive ancestors." So I thought, okay, interesting, but that doesn't seem like a very empirical estimate. And then I found that there was a second paper that people were citing, which was this one by Vernon Edmagian from 1995. And in it, he says, according to Doug Larson of the University of Guelph, approximately 8% of the Earth's terrestrial surface has lichens as its most dominant life forms. Okay, so then I contacted Doug directly, and I asked him about the nature of the 8%. And what he told me was that it was never intended to be a sort of a stand-up empirical estimate. He said it was an estimate that he and Edmagian had come up with together back in the 80s to sort of garner support for lichenology research. But he was surprised to have learned that it was in fact being cited as if it was true, and he said they had never done any kind of true empirical measure of how much of the Earth was lichen dominated. So I decided to track this number as it appears in the literature. Where does it appear? 57 peer-reviewed papers, 3 books, and a number of popular science media locations. This statistic is everywhere, and it is very commonly cited in introductions and in other places where it's being used to sort of garner interest in lichen biology, which means it's pretty important if it's being used that frequently and in that way. But again, it's not based on an empirical number. Perhaps even more concerning, in many instances, it's actually quite misconstrued or misused. So of the 60 peer-reviewed articles and books, 12 don't state it as an estimate. They state it with some kind of certainty. 9 change the number, so I found anywhere between 6 to 10%, even if they cited Larson or Edmagian directly. And 18 change it from ecosystem dominance to something else, usually something like surface coverage. Or abundance, which is not necessarily the same thing depending on how you're measuring it and how you're defining it. So this is problematic with having it so misconstrued and misused in so many places, especially in the way that it's being used as foundational knowledge for the field. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how widely spread this is, this graph shows the number of times that the 8% has been used in a scientific paper. Across the x-axis here we have the year, and on the y-axis here we have time cited in that year. And up here I've just indicated when Larson 1987 was published, when Acknowledgements 1995 was published, and also when Nash 2008, which is a very popular lichen biology textbook, was published. And what you can see here is, of course, in the early days before anything else, it was just Larson. As soon as Acknowledgements gets published, some of the citations go to him, I guess because people didn't know about Larson's work. But interestingly, after the Nash textbook was published, there's a ton of extra citations here. It really skyrockets in use. But interestingly, we see a lot of citations for or by other people. So they're no longer citing the original source of Larson or even of Magian, if you want to use that. And they're starting to cite other things, which is especially concerning. And I do want to point out, neither Larson nor Admagian's papers were peer-reviewed, which is why they're so difficult to find, which may be why you see these other citations, because people can't find these because they're not listed in your sort of normal databases. And just to sort of give a detailed illustration of this, this is how deep one has to go to find the citation sometimes. So there's a 2019 paper here, which again, you can look at the numbers as they change through time. But in 2019, so this paper was published that mentions the statistic, but it cited this 2017 paper, which cited the textbook, which then cites Larson. So we're now 3 degrees away from the original source, with no note linking the original source back to this ultimate paper here in 2019. And this isn't to point out specific authors' mistakes, it's more to indicate how easily we slip into this habit of grabbing the citation from whoever talked about it, not the ultimate source, as it should be. So what have I learned from this? First and foremost, never ever assume anything from a citation. So just because something is cited doesn't mean it's necessarily even true, or it might not be the type of citation you're after. If you just read a citation and you don't read the paper itself, you may not know, how did they collect the data? What kind of data was it? What definitions did they use or what kind of assumptions did they use to arrive at their methods and their conclusions? And check ultimate sources, not the most convenient one. So just because another sort of well-informed and maybe well-respected group of authors uses a certain citation, don't just take that on its word. Read through the sources yourself. Again, they might be using it for different purposes than you. They may just be using it because it's what everyone else is using, and that's not a good enough reason to use a source. You need to check it yourself and see where the data is coming from. And it turns out dragging old scientists out of retirement can be awfully fruitful. I've been able to have the privilege of starting to work with Doug Larson on this project, which has been a lot of fun and greatly informative to learn more about lichen biology as it was in the 80s. And hopefully we're going to be moving forward on this, which is really exciting. And I wanted to include this quote by Stephen Jay Gould in his collection of essays in Bully for Brontosaurus, where he says, authors of textbooks are copying material on a massive scale and passing along to students an ill-considered and virtually Xeroxed version with a rationale lost in the mists of time. And I think this is an accurate description of sometimes what happens with these citations, where we see the same paper cited over and over again, especially by, well-respected authors and well-respected scientists, which is fine. But we don't necessarily check these sources for ourselves, and we don't check where the data is coming from, how it was done, and whether it's actually relevant to what we're talking about. So it's something to consider for all of us as we do our work, why we cite what we do. So the next step, what's the real number? How much of the world is actually covered in lichens, and to what percentage do lichens actually dominate terrestrial vegetation? So I'm very excited to be working on this new project now, which is an empirical estimate of global lichen ecosystem dominance. We have decided that we are going to be measuring coverage because coverage is sort of more easily defined and easily measured compared to something like biomass, which would take a massive amount of work and would likely be well beyond the scope of a PhD. As for who is collaborating, it's as many lichenologists as we can ask. So we are very excited to be hopefully working with the International Association of Lichenologists, who are meeting later this summer. So we're going to be working with them. There's also a number of sort of popular lichen groups that connect both the public and lichen biologists. So we're basically going to be combining on-the-ground field surveys by worldwide lichenologists with remote sensing models using Landsat imagery and others, with modeling to basically scale from an ecosystem or biome level up to the global scale. So we're very excited about this project. I would really love to acknowledge my committee, especially Toby Srabilla, for connecting me with so many great lichenologists. Peter and Matt, very excited to start working with them for remote sensing work. And I'm very happy to take questions or comments, or if you're interested in the project and you want to collaborate, you can find me, here's my email, or here's my Twitter handle, and thank you very much for listening.